Buddy, it is week 45. Welcome back to my garage. Okay, this week we had MLK Day and we had a presidential inauguration. There's been so much scripture being quoted this week that it's made me think more about what does it mean to be a Christian and an American. One of the lines of scripture that was quoted actually was one of Washington's favorite lines of scripture to quote. And if you've ever seen the Broadway musical Hamilton, then you've heard him sing it. Everyone will sit under their own vine and fig tree, and no one will make them afraid. Washington, in the Broadway show, is singing that to Alexander Hamilton, who's trying to convince Washington to run for a third term. And while I know that's Broadway and not history, Washington refused many attempts to get him to run for a third term. But that line he loved to quote came from the 4th chapter of Micah. And the prophet Micah is describing what it's like when the mountain of the house of God comes. And what happens is people from all these different nations, from all these different countries come together and they learn from God. People that were enemies, they come together and they beat their swords into plows and they beat their spears into pruning hooks. The tools that they used to be against each other are now tools they used to be with and for and farm together. And everyone sits under their own vine and fig tree, and no one makes them afraid. It's clear that the prophet Micah is saying that the identity you receive from God should influence your national identity. That the identity we receive in our faith, the identity of being beloved children of God, followers of Jesus, should influence our identity as citizens of this great nation. So what does that look like? Well, first of all, what does God do? God makes us. God creates us for fellowship with God. God shares with us relationship, shares with us love, shares with us the fellowship of the Trinity. And then what does Jesus do? Jesus, the incarnation, the one, God in the flesh, the one in whom the fullness of God dwells. What does Jesus do? With all that divine power, Jesus washes his disciples' feet. He serves those he came to save. You know, his disciples, there's this one story where there's these thousands of people and Jesus has been teaching them and they're getting hungry. And the disciples say, hey, Jesus, let's send them away to get some food because they're hungry, because the disciples kind of want to get away from those people who need food. And Jesus doesn't do that. Even though with all of his divine power and authority, he could have snapped his fingers and made them no longer hungry. Jesus says to the disciples, no, you give them something to eat. Jesus shares the care and concern he has for the crowd with the disciples. Jesus shares the responsibility of feeding them with the disciples. And so maybe that's what it means for our Christian identity to influence our American identity, to be generous and share the way God is generous and shares with us, to share fellowship and love, to share if maybe we have more than enough vines and fig trees to share with those who have none. If we have more than enough power and influence to share with those who don't have any. And maybe that's what Washington was doing. Maybe he was sharing his power and influence with those who didn't have any. So my challenge to you this week is this: to just ask the question, what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus and for my discipleship to influence my citizenship? What does it mean for my identity as a beloved child of God to influence my identity as a citizen of this great nation? We have Zoom Sunday school class. We've got small groups meeting. Most of them are outdoors in person, and worship is happening in person. So come 8:30 or 11 and come worship together with your family. Remember, God's up to something. Be a part of it.